When the question is, what will the Supreme Court do? There is no one better to ask than Harvard Law professor and very successful Supreme Court practitioner, Laurence Tribe. And when the question is, what is Attorney General Merrick Garland going to do? There is no one available to us who is better to ask than Merrick Garland's constitutional law professor, Laurence Tribe. And so, with those two questions in mind tonight, we are joined now by Professor Laurence Tribe, who has taught constitutional law at Harvard Law School for 5 decades. Thank you very much for joining us again tonight. Now that both sides have made their filings to the Supreme Court, what do you expect the Supreme Court to do in the case of Donald J. Trump versus United States of America?
Well, thanks for having me, Laurence. Let me say that I think the panelists you had, if they were a law firm, the firm of Weissman, Vance, and Moss, would be dynamite because they got it exactly right. The Supreme Court is really not going to do any favors to Donald Trump. His submission to the Supreme Court was very weak, and what was there was utterly pulverized, crushed by the brilliant brief by the Justice Department. Not only did the Justice Department in the Supreme Court use Donald Trump's briefing in the Court of Appeals against him, because in the Court of Appeals, he was basically saying, slow down, slow down. And in the Supreme Court, the thing he had to say was, it's an emergency, speed up. He can't have it both ways. So he's basically undermining himself, and the Solicitor General made short work of that. But there's another point, and that is she quite brilliantly structured this brief so that in ruling for the Justice Department and against Donald Trump, along the way, it is almost certain that the Supreme Court of the United States is going to make a number of statements that in the 11th Circuit are going to doom Trump's effort to hold on to the loose cannon that he managed to find to give him some relief with the special master. That is, what they will determine about the posture of the case in the Supreme Court will make it almost impossible for him to prevail in the 11th Circuit. So all the smoke will clear, and then the stage will be set for the Attorney General, who in the meantime is allowed, by virtue of the relief he already got from the 11th Circuit, which is not being appealed to the Supreme Court in that respect, is already able to pursue an investigation using the materials marked classified. At that point, there won't be very much work left for the Justice Department to do before the ultimate decision comes to Merrick Garland and is on his desk.
Before we get to that Garland decision, is one of the options on this Supreme Court case at this point for the Supreme Court just in one sentence to just say that the Trump request is denied?
Absolutely. And that would be a perfectly normal thing to do. With an ordinary litigant, that is the most likely outcome, because he doesn't even meet the threshold requirement of showing irreparable harm. As Andy Weissman correctly pointed out, the only irreparable harm is to the United States of America and the Department of Justice in having to slow anything down and show anything to the special master. Because in an ordinary case, you wouldn't need or have a special master. You would simply have the court that ordered the warrant, issued the warrant, ordered the search. There's no claim that the search was illegal. There's no claim that the president actually did anything to declassify the documents, despite his claim that he did it by some telepathic process, a claim that he makes only out of court but not in court. So it's really quite clear that the path is open for going forward.
You've known Merrick Garland since he was one of your law students. I know you've read that Atlantic piece today predicting that Merrick Garland will decide to indict Donald Trump in this case. What is your expectation?
I do expect exactly the same thing, because to his very core, Merrick Garland believes in the rule of law. People call him an institutionalist, but he's told me, and I think he told Franklin Foer, that he doesn't use that term for himself. That sounds sort of like a bureaucrat, though in prettier clothes. But he is committed to law, to following the law where it leads, to the reality-based world as opposed to the fantasy-based world. And the law and the facts here inexorably lead to conclusions about the president having taken government documents that don't belong to him, having stored them illegally in unsafe places, having apparently attempted to use them as bargaining chips, telling the government at various points, if you want some of these things back, you want me to turn them over to the National Archives, why don't you give me some of the FBI records that are involved in my supposed dealings with Russia, transactional down to the bone. It seems to me that in these circumstances, it's clear that all three of the crimes that led to the search and seizure, the three alleged crimes, are strongly provable, including obstruction of justice. And that's not even to mention the grave crimes involving seditious conspiracy and insurrection. So the real questions before Merrick Garland are not whether to indict, but when and where and for which crimes. Where, he'll have to decide whether to indict in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, he could do even over the Mar-a-Lago offenses, because they began when he took the documents illegally from the White House in Washington, and it was institutions in Washington that he was stiffing and deceiving when he didn't return them. And when it comes to trying the case in Washington, there one could include insurrection and seditious conspiracy in addition to espionage, theft of government documents, and obstruction of justice. And the question of when depends very much on exactly when all the ducks are lined up in a row, when all of the witnesses are ready. Merrick Garland is not going to bring less than an overwhelming case. That I know by knowing him for all these years. He doesn't do things halfway. He's enormously thorough. And I am among those who from time to time is frustrated by his thoroughness. When he was my research assistant years ago, sometimes I'd say, can't you get this done overnight? You're so brilliant. And sometimes he would take the extra 3 hours to turn in something that was absolutely over the top. This will be an indictment that is absolutely over the top, leaving no stone unturned. And I think it's important, despite the angst that will generate and the threatened violence and all the rest, that will be the beginning, I predict, of national healing, when we will begin to see that no one really is above the law, that in fact, even the president of the United States and a former president is accountable. And I think that will make a big difference, because it's all very nice for people to say, in theory, we're going to riot, we're going to do violent things if you follow the law. Let's just see what happens. I think Merrick Garland is not going to be put off by that.
Professor Laurence Tribe, thank you very much for joining us again tonight.
Thank you, Laurence.
Thank you.